Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
I have checked you out on Blue Sky because I'm there as Lawrence O'Donnell on Blue Sky. Andrew Weissman's on Blue Sky, and he's going to be our first guest tonight. It's a Blue Sky night here at this hour.
Plenty to talk to Andrew about tonight. My God, this drama
there's a little
with
bit.
SDNY. And...
Yeah, there's a bit. Yeah, the era of principled resignation is upon us, Rachel.
Yeah.
Once again, and I got to say, as a kid who saw it in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre in the Nixon administration, it was the most inspiring turn because when it happened, it seemed very dark. It didn't seem like it was going to have an effect. It seemed like that's the end of the investigation. It also seemed brave for Attorney General Elliot Richardson to make the choice he made. But another prosecutor was appointed, and that prosecutor went all the way. Richard Nixon was driven out. And so in the totality of the experience, kids in high school at the time just thought they lived in a country where, yes, the rule of law prevails and no one's above the law. And we had a right to feel that way for the rest of the 20th century. It was a good feeling for what we thought was forever. It turned out to be a long time, but not quite forever.
Although we remember the Saturday Night Massacre because of what Nixon tried to do, but mostly what we remember it for was the heroism of Elliot Richardson and the men at the Justice Department then who stood up and said, that is an unprincipled thing and I'm not doing it, and you're going to have to go through me if you want to do it. And that heroism stands no matter the outcome, right? This letter from the acting U.S. attorney at SDNY to Attorney General Pam Bondi saying, I have been asked to do something unethical, wrong, against the rules, and potentially against the law here, and I am not doing it. I'm not seeking to resign. I'm happy to stay in my job as long as you fix this, but if you don't fix this, I'm out. And she's out. And no matter what happens with this case, that example of heroism lives. And it is that's where the moral ends here, because that's showing the country what values call on us to do sometimes, and the kind of sacrifices that people will make to do the right thing for the country. And I don't know how this story will end, and I don't know what's going to happen to Eric Adams. We heard Kathy Hochul right here on this show tonight say that she is newly looking at her unique powers to potentially remove him as New York City mayor herself. I don't know how this is going to resolve, but what that U.S. attorney did at SDNY tonight, that's forever.
Yeah, Danielle Sassoon's name takes its place on the wall of honor, which now has to be an imaginary wall at the current Justice Department with Elliot Richardson, with Archibald Cox, with the truly great principled people who have worked there and worked there through this kind of crisis.
And she is a registered Republican.
Yeah.
She is a Federalist Society member. She is an Anton Scalia clerk. She is a rock-ribbed conservative. According to the New York Times tonight, she's also about to give birth in a couple of weeks. But, you never know. Heroism comes in all colors and from all parts of the ideological number line. And we got to take these moments when we have them, because they're not only important to tell us something about that person, but they tell us something about us as a country, and they model the kind of behavior that we all need modeled for us at times to keep us on the straight and narrow. Yeah,
and that's exactly what guided my decisions about how to shape this hour tonight. The need to highlight this when we have it. I had to throw out everything I had planned for tonight once this happened, because this really is the kind of moment where Danielle Sassoon really deserves our attention tonight, and the principled people who resigned with her today do too.
Watch this space. That's exactly right, Lawrence.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you. Well, tonight in Donald Trump's America, if an FBI agent sees someone committing a federal crime, that FBI agent is not allowed to intervene in any way. Not allowed to flash a badge and make an arrest. That FBI agent is not allowed to investigate the crime being committed right before his eyes in Donald Trump's America, as long as the crime is being committed by the mayor of New York City. Since Monday, on what was the 21st day of the Trump political weaponization of the Justice Department, the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has known that the FBI is no longer allowed to investigate anything he does anywhere at any time. Just think about that. No one in American history, including past presidents, has ever had the benefit of the FBI being banned in writing from investigating that person? No one. So if this is one of those typical nights on the town for the self-styled New York nightlife celebrity Eric Adams, he will be at one of the city's most exclusive and expensive nightclubs until at least 2 a.m. That's standard for him. There have been more than twice as many mayors of New York than presidents of the United States, because the city of New York is much older than the United States of America. In 360 years of New York mayors, beginning in 1665, none of them have enjoyed the nightlife more than Eric Adams, including the most corrupt New York City mayors like the notorious Jimmy Walker, who fled the city to avoid federal prosecution in 1932. Tonight may be an especially late night for the mayor because he has more to celebrate than he ever has before. Donald Trump's Justice Department put an order in writing on Monday saying there shall be no further targeting of Mayor Adams or additional investigative steps. No one in the Justice Department is allowed to investigate the mayor of New York City as of Monday. And the mayor of New York, who's already under federal indictment for crimes including bribery, has known since Monday that he can violate any federal law he wants now, and there will not be an investigation, cannot be an investigation. That order is in full force tonight and has been in full force all week. But another order issued in the same Justice Department memo on Monday has been defied by the prosecutor who received that order. That order from the Justice Department said, you are directed as authorized by the Attorney General to dismiss the pending charges in United States versus Adams. That memo was sent from the acting Deputy Attorney General to the acting U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. The sender and the receiver of that memo personify what the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Jackson, meant when he said this in 1940. The prosecutor, at his best, is one of the most beneficent forces in our society. When he acts from malice or other base motives, he is one of the worst. That memo was sent by one of the worst to one of the best. The acting Deputy Attorney General is Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, Emile Beauvais. I sat behind Emile Beauvais for weeks when he was the #2 defense counsel for Donald Trump in the criminal case where a Manhattan jury found Donald Trump guilty of 34 counts of business fraud. There is no reason to equate a criminal defense lawyer with the criminal defendant the lawyer represents. The criminal defense lawyer is one of the noble callings under the American system of justice. There was nothing in Emile Beauvais' representation of Donald Trump in that courtroom that gave me the slightest reason to disrespect his work in that room as a criminal defense lawyer. In fact, I thought Emile Beauvais did a better job in that courtroom than the lead defense counsel, Todd Blanche, who Donald Trump has nominated for a position in the Justice Department that requires Senate confirmation. Emile Beauvais previously served as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, where he was, we discovered this week, an enthusiastic supporter of the investigations and prosecutions of the January 6th attackers at the Capitol. Now that he is working in Donald Trump's Justice Department, he has made it his personal mission to search out, find, and attempt to fire any FBI agent or federal prosecutor who worked on any of the January 6th prosecutions, which he personally, enthusiastically supported inside the Justice Department before he left the department in 2022. Today, the acting U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, 38-year-old Danielle Sassoon, resigned after refusing to ask the judge to dismiss the criminal case against Mayor Adams. And so the principled resignation is back. There is nothing quite like the principled resignation in American politics. They have been rare because periods of crisis in government have been rare. Most of the 20th century sailed by without a principled resignation of note until what the headline writers called the Saturday Night Massacre in 1973, when Republican President Richard Nixon ordered his Republican Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire his friend, the Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was investigating Richard Nixon. Attorney General Richardson resigned instead of firing Archibald Cox, and then the Deputy Attorney General resigned instead of carrying out the president's order. And then President Nixon found Solicitor General Robert Bork willing to do that firing. But the whole scheme didn't work. A new special prosecutor was appointed, and Richard Nixon was driven out of office, and the honorable people who resigned or were fired in that so-called Saturday Night Massacre lived the rest of their lives in public honor because of that moment. Archibald Cox was revered for the rest of his life in legal circles because of that attempt that Richard Nixon made to fire him, which eventually succeeded. The surge of confidence in the American judicial system and prosecutorial system was something that you really had to live through then to even begin to comprehend or feel. Kids who were in high school would live the rest of the 20th century with the full confidence that no one is above the law, the full confidence that the principled resignation is more powerful than a corrupt president. There have been some relatively minor and little noticed principled resignations at other times. Two Assistant Secretaries of Health and Human Services, Mary Jo Bain and Peter Edelman, resigned in 1996 over President Clinton's embrace of a Republican welfare bill that President Clinton signed into law. Those resignations had no effect, which in a way made them even more noble, possibly. The effect of a principled resignation is not the point. We have seen the principled resignation become one of the cracks in the wall that took down a president, but those resignations would still be important even if they didn't drive President Nixon from office, because the point of the principled resignation is the principle. Yesterday, Danielle Sassoon sent an 8-page letter to the Attorney General, Pamela Jo Bondi, asking for a meeting with her. It was a letter from the lead prosecutor in the criminal case against the mayor of New York, asking the Attorney General to have a meeting about the case after Emil Bovey ordered Danielle Sassoon to have the case dismissed. Danielle Sassoon knew how her letter would be received by the Attorney General. She knew that her letter was filled with brave defiance, principled defiance of Emil Bovey and Donald Trump's desires. And so the last line of Danielle Sassoon's letter to the Attorney General says, in the event you are unwilling to meet or to reconsider the directive in light of the problems raised by Mr. Bovey's memo, I am prepared to offer my resignation. It has been and continues to be my honor to serve as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. It turns out Danielle Sassoon's last act as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York was to write an 8-page indictment of Emil Bovey. Her letter says, quote, the evidence against Adams proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed federal crimes, and that to ask a judge to dismiss the case would be, quote, inconsistent with my ability and duty to prosecute federal crimes without fear or favor and to advance good faith arguments before the courts. In other words, she couldn't go into a courtroom and lie to a judge in order to get the case dismissed against the mayor of New York. Because in her view, that's exactly what Emil Bovey was asking her to do, ordering her to do, knowing that Attorney General Bondi was unlikely to know anything about her. Danielle Sassoon flashed her conservative credentials in the letter, noting that she served as a clerk for Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who was then the most conservative member of the Supreme Court. She didn't mention the Wall Street Journal op-ed piece that she wrote at the end of her first week as the U.S. Attorney on February 2nd, 2025, sharply criticizing President Biden's commutation of the sentences of almost 2,500 nonviolent offenders. She didn't mention that she's a member of the Federalist Society, a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. She noted the two reasons Emil Bovey gave for dismissing the case against Eric Adams, and she said, I cannot advance either argument in good faith. Mr. Bovey proposes dismissing the charges against Adams in return for his assistance in enforcing the federal immigration laws, analogizing to the prisoner exchange in which the United States freed notorious Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout in return for an American prisoner in Russia. She quotes the Justice Department manual saying, the legal judgments of the Department of Justice must be impartial and insulated from political influence. She quoted Attorney General Bundy's memo to Justice Department employees saying they must not allow political influence in their decision-making, saying, in your words, the Department of Justice will not tolerate abuses of the criminal justice process, coercive behavior, or other forms of misconduct, dismissal of the indictment for no other reason than to influence Adams's mayoral decision-making would be all three. Although Mr. Bove disclaimed any intention to exchange leniency in the case for Adams' assistance in enforcing federal law, that is the nature of the bargain laid bare in Mr. Bove's memo. That is especially so given Mr. Bove's comparison to the Bout prisoner exchange, which was quite expressly a quid pro quo, but one carried out by the White House, not by the prosecutors in charge of Bout's case. I attended a meeting on January 31st, 2025 with Mr. Bove, Adams's counsel, and members of my office. Adams's attorneys repeatedly urged what amounted to a quid pro quo, indicating that Adams would be in a position to insist with the department's enforcement priorities only if the indictment were dismissed. Mr. Bove admonished a member of my team who took notes during that meeting and directed the collection of those notes at the meeting's conclusion. Taking notes in meetings is what lawyers do. They take notes during phone calls. They take notes all the time. You want your lawyer taking notes all the time. Why did Emil Bove fear those notes? In his reply to Danielle Sassoon today, Emil Bove claimed that he seized those notes because he's afraid of leaks. In that case, no Trump lawyer in the Justice Department can ever be taking notes, according to the Emil Bove rules on notes. Danielle Sassoon revealed that there was more to come in the case against Eric Adams. We have proposed a superseding indictment that would add an obstruction conspiracy count based on evidence that Adams destroyed and instructed others to destroy evidence and provide false information to the FBI. And that would add further factual allegations regarding his participation in a fraudulent straw donor scheme. Danielle Sassoon reminded the Attorney General that it is not up to the prosecutors to dismiss a case that is already in court. Only a judge can do that. Danielle Sassoon warned the Attorney General the assigned district judge, the Honorable Dale E. Ho, appears likely to conduct a searching inquiry in this case. That means it is very possible that a searching inquiry will involve the judge forcing Emil Bove into the courtroom to try to defend his order to dismiss the case on political grounds, purely political grounds. Danielle Sassoon wrote, I remain baffled by the rushed and superficial process by which this decision was reached in seeming collaboration with Adams' counsel without my direct input on the ultimate stated rationales for dismissal. In his response to her letter, Emil Bove put all the assistant U.S. attorneys who worked on the Adams case on administrative leave, quote, pending investigations by the Office of the Attorney General and the Office of Professional Responsibility, both of which will also evaluate your conduct. The Adams case was transferred to the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. by Emil Bove, where it would have been assigned to the Public Integrity Section, and the two attorneys leading that section, John Keller and Kevin Driscoll, then promptly resigned today. The New York Times reports several hours later, 3 other lawyers in the unit also resigned, according to people familiar with the developments. So that's a total of 6 in one day. The principled resignations in the Justice Department tonight include 6 principled lawyers: Danielle Sassoon, John Keller, Kevin Driscoll, and 3 others. They follow the principled resignations of David Lebrick, who was the acting Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the department assigned to payments, who resigned when Elon Musk seized control of the United States Treasury. And there is one firing that should be counted in effect in the principled resignation column, and that is the Inspector General of the United States Agency for International Development, Paul Martin, who wrote a critical report on Monday of what Elon Musk is doing to USAID, whereupon he was promptly fired the next day. The principled resignation is now upon us. How many more? Leading off our discussion tonight is Andrew Weissmann, former FBI General Counsel and former Chief of the Criminal Division in the Eastern District of New York. He's also an MSNBC legal analyst. And Andrew, I want you to make every point that's going through your mind about this, but I just want to begin with the part of this order that says no one's allowed to investigate the mayor of New York City, who is already demonstrably corrupt in so many ways. Question remaining for a jury, is that criminally corrupt? I've never seen or heard of a prosecutor ordering no investigations of an individual, including people who were cooperating witnesses of theirs, including, people in the witness protection program who they're protecting otherwise.
So the normal rule when you have a criminal case, and when I started out, is you investigate up to and through the trial. You never stop investigating. The only time I could think of it is if you're investigating and at some point your supervisor says, you know what, there's no case there. That's not what happened here. Here, there is a case. So this is remarkable. And to Danielle's point about a quid pro quo, and this is something we talked about a few days ago, where when this news broke, where the dismissal that is being sought by Emil Bove is without prejudice. The idea is the sword of Damocles over his head. They have him on a choke collar. And so he knows at any moment this can be revisited. In fact, Emil Bove's letter says that. And we're seeing it already. If you're seeing what did they buy with that, on Monday, the reports are that Eric Adams met with his entire senior team, their general counsels, and said there's going to be no adverse talk about Donald Trump. You cannot mention him adversely. Second, we're getting reports today that he has said that ICE can now enforce and go into Rikers to arrest people for immigration offenses.
And just that is in a meeting. He's in a meeting today in his office with Homans, the guy running ICE, making that deal with him today, the same day that the U.S. attorney is resigning.
And Lawrence, here's the kicker. That is against New York law. The mayor of the city of New York, and this is where I'd say, Kathy Hochul, are you listening? Mm-hmm. The mayor of the city of New York today said that ICE can do something that the city council has prohibited. How? And you're wondering, I wonder, connect the dots. Why is he doing that? He has a choke collar on, and the effective mayor of the city of New York is Donald Trump, who no one voted for to be mayor. The one thing I want to sort of underline for people is how unusual this is in terms of what we're seeing. You had to go back to, and I also, I'm sort of old enough to go back to the Saturday Night Massacre. It does not happen. The only time I can really think of it, other than the Saturday Night Massacre, was Trump 1.0, where prosecutors resigned in the Roger Stone case because of what they were being ordered to do. Now, within weeks of Donald Trump retaking the White House, we are seeing a sort of I am Spartacus moment. It's Danielle Sassoon deserves all the credit you gave her, but it's wrong to think that it's just her. Mm-hmm. It is people, the people behind her in the Southern District of New York. I have numerous friends and colleagues and former colleagues who are totally supportive of this, regardless of political persuasion, who are prosecutors. You have all of the people at the FBI who are resisting the Emil Bove sort of mass roundup of people who participated in the January 6th case. And you have the people at Main Justice, the lawyers there. I used to be one myself, who also, the entire leadership of the public integrity section was like, we are, of all people in the public integrity section, they are not going to participate in a political order. So you really are seeing not just one person, and it's not about just the Southern District of New York. You are seeing people in all parts of the department, the FBI, Main Justice, in the field saying, not doing it.
Quick, before you go, didn't you think after the Saturday Night Massacre, 1973, that it was incredibly dramatic and it all played out and then Nixon's gone? And one thing I thought, literally until the Trump era, was That can never happen again. That'll never happen again. No one else will ever have to do that. An attorney general will never have to resign because no president will ever follow in Nixon's footsteps like this.
Absolutely. But I would remind people of the way I felt in Trump 1.0, which was Trump. The first thing that you saw was the first iteration of the Muslim ban that was, in my view, blatantly illegal. And with the appointment of Robert Mueller in May, there was a real sense of the rule of law still exists. And now this is what you're seeing, because there are enough people who act out of principle. And I think the thing that is taking, I would suspect, Emil Bove, Pamela Bondi, and the White House by surprise is, you know what? There are a lot of people in this country who act out of principle. Final point on this, if you'll remember, I keep on raising this. We had a trial of Paul Manafort. We had a sort of strong Republican, and she said, I left my MAGA hat in the car. I told the judge that I was going to base my verdict on the facts and the law, and that's what I did, because there are people in this country who will act out of principle.
Yeah, she found a good. She was on this program. She was just exactly what you're hoping the juror would be. Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. The most important testimony delivered in Congress this week was from a former USAID official, Sarah Charles, who will join us next. Today, during a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on the United States Agency for International Development, Democratic Congressman of California, Brad Sherman, said this.
There's a sad incident. 71-year-old Pei Kao Lau. She was able to survive and flee from Myanmar to Thailand. She was in a camp with over 10,000 people. They cut off the money and they cut off her oxygen, and she died. And no future waiver is going to bring her back to life.
Yesterday, Sarah Charles, the former head of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, testified to a group of Senate Democrats.
For any of you that have traveled to see USAID programs in action, you may have seen a nutrition center treating severely malnourished children. It is truly a horrific sight. Children, particularly susceptible to disease in environments with poor water and sanitation, maybe without access to vaccines, are particularly vulnerable to wasting, what we call the severest forms of malnutrition. It takes children quite quickly. Even those children who don't die can have permanent brain damage. But the miracle of malnutrition is it can be treated quite inexpensively and quite easily, largely with products that are produced using peanuts grown in the United States, produced in manufacturing facilities in Georgia and Rhode Island, highly nutritious food that are a gift from the American people to severely malnourished children around the world.
Joining us now is Sarah Charles. Sarah, thank you very much for making the time to join us. When I heard your testimony yesterday, and with so much detail that's so important, could you tell us more about what it means to starving children? I mean, there's like 700,000 just in Sudan alone, and how actually easy it is for us to, we know how to do this intervention. We have paid for it. The money's already been spent, and yet it's been stopped by Elon Musk.
That's right. One of the greatest gifts that the American people have given the world is our commitment to treat malnutrition around the world, particularly targeting the most vulnerable, the youngest children, those that are in war zones, that are susceptible to disease. The American people, for a long time, with bipartisan support, have been incredibly proud of this gift to children around the world.
Yesterday was your first time speaking only to Democratic senators, because Republican senators will not allow a hearing on this. And so the Democrats had to set up their own session. So how kind of shocking is it to you that this suddenly stopped being a bipartisan effort? Because it's a very popular program with Midwestern farmers, for example, who are reliable Republican voters, and their senators used to be.
It's been one of the many shocking elements of the last 3 weeks. These are programs that have been supported by Republicans and Democrats in Congress for years. There's a bipartisan Food Security Caucus that has a large number of members, both on the House and the Senate side. I'm from South Carolina. Former South Carolina Governor David Beasley led the World Food Program during the first Trump administration and did a phenomenal job of bringing along many members of Congress to see these programs in action, created many converts, supporters of these programs. And we've seen in just the last 3 weeks vicious and malicious campaign of lies to paint what is really the best of the American people, the generosity of the American people, as something.
I think we have I hope we can get Sarah's video back. We have a photograph of Sarah Charles with Samantha Powers. I think we can put that up. Do we have it? They're at a feeding center in East Africa. Generally, the photographs taken in those situations don't show the starving babies out of respect, and so these usually are mothers who they're speaking with and meeting there. We've lost our connection with Sarah Charles. Thank her very, very much for joining us tonight and for the work she's done. And coming up at the top of this hour, after 12 hours of a House Budget Committee meeting, the Budget Committee passed their budget resolution, giving Donald Trump a $4 trillion increase in the debt limit. That's the first thing Republicans are doing, is voting to increase the debt by $4 trillion. The top Democrat on the committee, Congressman Brendan Boyle, will join us next. Nearly 12 hours after the House Budget Committee began debating the Republican budget plan, the top Democrat on the committee, Congressman Brendan Boyle, said this.
Each of our amendments was a direct effort to shield the American people from the reckless cuts embedded in this proposal. Cuts that will hurt the most vulnerable while giving trillions of dollars of handouts to the ultra-rich. We fought to protect Medicaid and Medicare, ensuring that seniors, low-income families, children, and people with disabilities don't see their health care stripped away. We worked to preserve the ACA tax credits, which allow millions of Americans to afford health coverage, and to defend Social Security, a bedrock promise that ensures retirees can live with dignity after a lifetime of work. Despite the clear benefits of these proposals, Republicans oppose all of them. Instead of choosing to protect the American people, they chose to protect billionaires and corporations. Let's be clear about what is at stake. House Republicans are once again betraying the middle class of this country and those who aspire to be in it.
Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania. He's the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee, also a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Congressman Boyle, I'm trying to feign surprise that the party that is constantly hammering about the increase in the national debt and refusing to ever support and fight in every way a debt ceiling increase when there's a Democratic president, the very first thing they want to do is increase the national debt by $4 trillion.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Lawrence. I've said previously in this committee a couple of years ago, you can always tell when there's a Democrat in the White House because it's the only time Republicans pretend to care about the national debt. But then the very moment there is a Republican in the White House and Republicans have control of Congress, their agenda is add to the national debt in order to finance tax cuts, most of which go to the richest 1%. That was the case 8 years ago, it was the case in the Bush era, and here it is the case today, where they just passed, after 12 consecutive hours of debate in which the Democratic side vigorously fought back, offering more than 30 amendments. In the end, however, no Republicans joined with us. And so they passed their reckless, I believe, immoral budget blueprint, which provides for $4.5 trillion of tax cuts that mostly go to the richest 1%. It's financed by an increase in the debt, but it's also financed by $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, and those aren't specified quite yet. They'll be specified in the budget reconciliation bill, which is the package that completes this legislative exercise. And today you were just trying to get in writing, when the reconciliation package comes out, it's not going to cut Medicaid. It's not going to cut health care. And they wouldn't do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of my Democratic colleagues offered an amendment which, if they were sincere in saying they wouldn't cut Medicaid, wouldn't cut Medicare, they should have been the first ones to sign up for our amendment. They had every opportunity to make clear that we were apparently wrong, that they wouldn't cut Medicaid. But of course, they showed that, in fact, we were right, and they opposed our amendment. So based on the instructions that this resolution gives, and I know it gets a little complicated when talking about reconciliation, but the bottom line is there is no way for them to achieve the cuts to programs that are listed in their reconciliation blueprint without $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, in addition to hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts to other social programs, all in furtherance of their only agenda item they care about, massive tax cuts for the richest 1%.
Is there anything protected in this budget resolution other than the tax cuts?
You might not be surprised to learn, Lawrence, the answer to your question is no. It is remarkable, although neither of us are surprised, the staggering hypocrisy from the same crowd who spent the last 4 years crying crocodile tears about deficit and debt. The first opportunity they have to deliver for their billionaire donors, that's what's in the agenda.
Well, it's not over yet. We'll see how reconciliation goes. Congressman Brendan Boyle, we're going to need you a lot between now and then. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. And coming up, Donald Trump was once again humiliated in the Oval Office by Elon Musk, even though Musk wasn't there. That's next. Elon Musk manages to embarrass Donald Trump in the Oval Office, even when Musk isn't there.
When Elon Musk met with Prime Minister Modi earlier today, did he do so as an American CEO or did he do so as a representative of the U.S. government?
Are you talking about me?
No, Elon Musk.
Elon, I don't know.
He doesn't know. Joining us now is congressional historian Norm Ornstein. He's an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Norm, Musk commandeered the vice president's residence and sat there like a vice president with Modi today. He has a lot of business interests in India, huge market for Starlink and other enterprises of his. And you'll notice he doesn't have a kid crawling on his shoulders. He's showing the prime minister at least that respect. I don't know. I suspect he had some business interests in mind.
You know, it's all about the grift, Lawrence. And the fact that Donald Trump shrugged his shoulders about whether Elon Musk was operating as a private citizen or in his quasi-official capacity tells you everything you need to know about the lack of ethics and about the unconcern with people feathering their own nests, lining their own pockets at the expense of the American people. But, you know, it's not even close to the most shocking thing that we've seen even today. It's just disgraceful. I want to make a couple of comments on what Brendan Boyle said, and he's absolutely right. We have to remember that this will not be the last increase they will demand on the national debt. Next year, the huge tax cuts for the rich that Trump got enacted in 2017 expire. They will not let them expire. That will add trillions more to the debt, and they will be absolutely unconcerned with what happens as long as the billionaires and the multinational corporations get what they want. And of course, in return, Trump and his billionaire buddies will get even more in kickbacks. We are really not dealing with anything that comes close to recognizing what we expect out of government and what we expect out of just basic ethics. It's just appalling.
Yeah, and of course, as this budget process goes forward, it's not going to be necessarily easy to get this thing through. And once we get to the reconciliation stage, then we will have the actual legislative proposals of exactly what they are going to cut.
And remember that Republicans are almost certainly going to need Democrats. And what they're going to say is, we will have a shutdown on March 14th. We will default unless you provide us the votes. It would be wrong for Democrats, I believe morally wrong, to provide a single vote for what they're trying to do that will devastate the national economy and, of course, cause turmoil all around the world. And what Democrats need to do is to make sure, starting now, that people understand Republicans have all the reins of power. If they want to enact reckless policies that destroy the safety net, damage average Americans, all to feather the nests and fatten the wallets of the richest among us, then they have the responsibility to do it. And it would be wrong for Democrats to enable them, period.
Norm Ornstein, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Absolutely, Lawrence, every time.
We'll be right back. That is tonight's Last Word.